Welcome back, and this is the art segment of the Your Town show, where we talk about the myriad ways that the arts are the answer. Today our theme has been sense of place, passion for place. What is the interconnection of the arts and our home, and what we think about that and what we know? I'm really thrilled that in our next segment we're going to be visiting with Elliot Ruchowitz, an amazing poet, teacher. He's done a lot of translations, and he's been very, very strongly affiliated with one of the more iconic buildings, really, in the structures in the world, the Tor House. So, Elliot, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
So, tell us about Tor House, and what is your connection, and what should we know about Tor House?
Well, Tor House is really quite amazing. It was the home essentially built by the poet Robinson Jeffers. And the building started in 1918 and wasn't completed until after his death.
Oh.
So it's called Tor House, but actually there are a whole series of structures that were built. And one of the things about Tor House is that makes it really amazing is that it's really closely tied to Jeffers' poetry. Mm-hmm. And I could give a tour. I serve as a docent at Tor. Well, I serve a number of capacities at Tor House.
That's what I know.
I'm the vice president at Tor House. I also coordinate the annual poetry prize and the annual reading and performance series. And I also serve as a tour docent. And one of the things that I could do as a tour docent is I could give a tour in which all I did was either read or recite Jeffers' poems, all of which are site-specific.
Wow.
And you can't say that about any other literary residence in the world.
That's
where
wonderful.
The actual art is so closely tied to the physical presence of the place.
And is he the one who said, I see all the time, Monterey County is the greatest meeting of land and sea?
No, he wouldn't say that.
I always wonder.
No, but he was very much had a sense of place, both of where Tor House and Hawk Tower are, and Carmel Point, and also the coast to the south, which he hiked and camped in extensively. And he found in this, actually, if you'd like, I could read a piece that he wrote about the way in which place is so important in his poetry.
That would be wonderful.
So this is from Jeffers gave a talk called Themes of My Poems. And this is in 1941 when he was invited to give the inaugural address at a series in Washington, D.C. called Poet in Democracy. Yeah. Two other poets in that series were Robert Frost and Carl Sandburg. So you get a sense of Jeffers' stature. Yeah. And the talk he gave was called Themes in My Poems. And so he says, the simplest and commonest theme of my verse, the landscape of the Monterey Coast Range. I should say that this rocky coast is not only the scene of my narrative verse, but also the chief actor in it. These mountains rise sheer from the ocean. They are cut by deep gorges and are heavy with brush and forest. Remember, this is central, not southern California. There are no orange groves here and no oil wells, and Los Angeles is far away. These mountains pasture a few cattle and many deer. Hawk and vulture, eagle and heron fly here, as well as the seabirds and shorebirds, and there are clouds and sea fogs in summer and fine storms in winter. This coast is described throughout my narrative poems, but I will read, Jeffers writes, or would say, a brief piece that notices one special part of it. A mile or two along the coast, these 11 lines are called The Place for No Story, because the coast here is pure and grand. Its pure and simple grandeur seemed to me too beautiful to be the scene of any narrative poem of mine, and I have kept the promise I made to it. And so this is The Place for No Story, and interestingly enough, it takes place at Sobranes Creek, where we had the fire last year. Yeah. Quite appropriate for Jeffers. Yeah. The Place for No Story. The coast hills at Sobranes Creek, no trees, but dark, scant pasture drawn thin over rock shaped like flame. The old ocean at the land's foot, the vast gray extension beyond the long white violence. A herd of cows and the bull far distant, hardly apparent up the dark slope, and the gray air haunted with hawks. This place is the noblest thing I have ever seen. No imaginable human presence here could do anything but dilute the lonely, self-watchful passion.
Beautiful. Thank you. So, Elliot, you are also a poet. Really, I was just so mesmerized. I've seen your work and read your things for a long time, but I was particularly mesmerized recently at a reading that you did at the Henry Miller outpost,
right.
the lab they were calling it, and it was just beautiful. And those were selections primarily from your current
book, White Fire,
your newest White Fire. So, I would ask you to read a little bit from here. But first, let me tell people a little bit that Walter Rice was describing, and he was thinking that for his reaction was that many poems share your life with the reader as if we're intimate friends, which he really loved, and then that there's a lot about his notes about walking stick particularly. Thinking about trepidation and tragedy, but looking at the fear of the mountain lion attack in the redwood forest, and there's just again a sense of place, a sense of our place and our individual and maybe more universal role within that. And but I love how he ends his thoughts about your work, that the best thing is to keep walking, to keep living, and to keep loving. And so I just really thank you for being here and for being so active in our community, because I know that you're also, in addition to sharing your work in the public kinds of spaces that I saw you in recently and publishing your work, that you're also very, very engaged with our youth and others in facilitating their own creative process and their own engagement with our community. So would you please go ahead and read a couple things that really call to you right now from your beautiful work?
Yeah, a great many of my poems are actually inspired by lines from Robinson Jeffers. But since you mentioned the review, the piece that Walter mentions, I'll read that, called Walking Stick. And this was written for a young man named Jonathan Kligerman, and I knew him as a child, and one day I received a phone call from his parents that he had very tragically died young. And so I went for a long walk out into the redwoods, or actually I'd been walking in the redwoods and in the backcountry, and just had this sense that I was being watched. It's kind of very,
very likely.
and I had just been reading also the state parks thing about what to do about mountain lions.
Yeah, I always love it. They say, "What do? You have to go really big." I think, that's great news for me.
Yeah. So this is called Walking Stick for Jonathan Kligerman. All day I feel stalked as I walk deep in the redwood forest, as though the eyes of the mountain lion follow me. In my mind, I go over how to avoid mountain lion attacks. Don't bend down, don't turn and run away, try to appear larger than you are, and if attacked, fight back. I resist the temptation to pick up a redwood limb as a walking stick. I want it to protect myself. To walk these woods and find their stillness and beauty, I must set my fears aside. When I leave the redwood forest for the forest of this world, the mountain lion strikes. The news that you, whom I held as a child in my arms and watched over while you slept as though you were my own, are dead. I do not bend down. I do not turn and run away. I appear larger than I am. I fight back with this walking stick.
Oh, that's amazing. That's beautiful. Thank you so much. One of the things that strikes me all the time when I am with an artist's work in any format is the willingness of artists to really take a risk, to take a risk throughout their work. It's a risk to get the right shot. It's a risk to share the work. It's a risk to do this instead of something else. And when you publish your work and you're reading it in front of people, to share it in even more direct circumstances. So can you talk about your own creative life, really? How did you get involved? Did you know from an early age that you were going to be doing this?
Yeah, well, no, actually. I kind of looked at poetry as, this ideal I would love to do, but I never really worked at it. So, even though I wanted to be a poet, I never really was a poet. And I really, in life we move through life in different social roles. And one of the most frightening roles for me is to be a poet. I mean, the worst thing that can happen to me is to walk into a, you walk into a social gathering. Oh, here's Elliot. He's a poet. You think, oh God. So immediately, all the expectations.
Yeah.
So, when I'm a poet, I'm a poet, and when I'm not a poet, I'm not a poet. So I don't go through life. And there are people who commit themselves to poetry. I mean, the poets who have made names for themselves, who are out there really actively working at being a poet. And for them, I think that's how they identify themselves. That's mainly. And, life is too expansive for that, it seems to me. There's so much more. And, I taught for many years, and I was going to say that, I read this poem, The Walking Stick, when I do poetry in the schools. And, I read it at high schools, at, say, Monterey High School, at PG High School, but I also read it at Salinas High School. I read it at Rancho Cielo. I read it at Silver Star, schools run by the probation department. And in a way, it really kind of touches people, and then they can begin to talk about their own worlds. And we talk about a sense of place. And here on, the thing about Jeffers is he gives a sense of place for this peninsula and the beauty of the coast. Well, you move across the mountains into Central Valley, and you have a totally different sense of place. And what I love about working with the students there is that sense of place comes through. Their voice comes through so strongly, and it's a very different voice. It's not the sense of place is not the ocean, on the shore, but they're very, very different sounds, very different visual images, and that they can speak in that voice is really very exciting to have them have that, and to recognize this. Yeah, this is where I live. And there's a wonderful Irish poet named Yvonne Boland who has a book where she talks about sense of place, because she had to deal with growing up in Ireland divided, and also as a woman and as a poet. And she talks about her neighborhood, the neighborhood she grew up in, how when she first moved in, she didn't have a sense of place. But gradually she got to pass people and see people, that developed. And so in my own writing, I have a number of poems which deal with where I lived for a long time, where I still live in the Carmel Highlands. And the people who lived there, the people who occupied, I mean, they were the place. They were what made that place the place, as well as the incredible beauty out there. And generally, in terms of writing, I find for me, the only way I really can get started is by writing about something concrete, something specific. Because what that does is that evokes the kind of metaphor quality of poetry. So you're writing about one thing, but suddenly you realize, well, that's not what I'm really writing about.
So you don't always know. This is something that's mesmerizing about the creative process. Sometimes people have a vision and then they just start to get to work to make it happen. And but sometimes they just start.
Yeah, well, or you can start with a feeling, or at least for me, and this isn't true for everyone, is I can start just writing about something concrete, and sometimes it'll hold together totally on its own. And for a while after my wife died, all I did was write haiku, simply because there's no messing around with haiku. You're just right there, and it seemed to me that I just wanted to get to the essence of things. When you deal with tragedy and you deal with grief. You don't have to play games. You just want to be right there at the center of things. And so in a way, the images themselves are just saying it all. So I begin White Fire with, which has two dedications. There's one at the beginning and one at the end, and the one at the end actually deals with So Brown Is Fire too. But the first is because the first part of the book is dedicated to my late wife, Tay, and so the book has kind of the dedication to the book is really this particular haiku, which is called "The Hummingbird Blesses the Day."
Would you be able to read that for us?
Yeah. First one day, first one flower, then another, no lingering, so quick, there, here, gone. First one flower, then another, no lingering, so quick, there, here, gone.
Thank you. So, Elliot, what's next for you? You are so amazing, and you're such a also wonderful. I know part of your career, your time, has been devoted to translating, and that as a teacher, you're facilitating constantly other people's work as well as working on your own. What's next?
Well, when you get to my age, what's next is tomorrow. Or not even tomorrow. What's next is what happens when I leave the studio here.
What does happen?
So I don't look too far ahead, but I do have. I started, just kind of out of a quirk. I started doing a bestiary, a poetical bestiary.
Oh, is that right?
And where and an alphabetical one where you choose like aardvark, and you write a poem about an aardvark. And I must have about half of it. What happened was it started out just kind of as a kind of a very light thing. And then it got more and more serious. So the poems towards the end, when I get to Z, they're really substantial. But the first ones, so I have to go back and redo all of those.
Okay.
So that's probably a project
to work
because they're also, there are a lot of them are love poems too. So that's so that's probably something I'll work on.
Will you work with an illustrator maybe or something?
I was thinking about that. Because there are some incredible books out there, some incredible bestiaries out there, and which have been very inspiring to me. But hopefully with an illustrator and that would be fun if that works out.
Wonderful.
Then there's for a long time I've kind of sat on these poems and manuscripts by the poet Eric Barker.
Okay.
And one of the things I would like to do is edit his work to a collected poems of Eric Barker, if I ever get to that.
Oh, that's amazing. So meanwhile, we can find White Fire.
You can find that at the Henry Miller Library in Big Sur, and I think also Pilgrim's Way probably has some copies. Yeah.
Wonderful. Is there a place online to catch
I think you can get them online from the Henry Miller Library. The nice thing about having someone publish your work is you don't have to worry about how it gets. That's their problem. So
look for White Fire for sure. It's full of wonderful poems that you can pick up and put down and pick up again and again and again. And Elliot, thank you so much for everything that you do in our region and to keep this such a creative, vibrant place. Thank you for sharing today.
Okay, thank you.